You there?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, that's great.
And I believe we are recording at this point. Perhaps I can figure out how to edit out the original stuff.
Or you can just let it be the technology challenge that we're having. Are you not cameraing? Because if you're not cameraing, I'm not cameraing.
Well, I can, but I'm going to give you a better view than me, which is a little reservoir that I'm sitting above in Moraga.
Okay, that looks like a prison.
Yeah, isn't that weird? It looks like a Folsom Tower, watchtower.
Yes, it does. That's exactly what it looks like.
Yeah, it's actually I don't know, that like a pumping station for the. So I'm up in Moraga, California. Tara and I are here together, uh, seemingly apart for a minute there, and here to talk more about the development of the ideas and concepts that perhaps we can boil down into a more digestible array of ideas. And I say that because I hear a lot of people talk about seeming to have some sense of something is right, but not quite understanding what it is. And I think that juxtaposition, in my experience, is a growing awareness of our knowing awareness in relation to an understanding awareness that we don't always, that we've been relying on so long that when it doesn't make sense to the understanding, we think it makes no sense to our knowing. And yet that division seems to be a very clear indicator, because I've heard it from 100 people over the years, that they're just beginning to notice that they have a very stable observatory capacity to notice what's happening that is right, because the rightness just seems to be obvious rather than be completely seemingly inobvious, because they're just thinking about their thinking about their thinking as to whether or not it's possible that it even exists. So I'm going to leave it more to Tara today, because she's had made some questions and created a little bit of a roadmap for me and has asked me to be a bit more concise than I tend to be, which I will do my best to be. But one of the reasons I am working with somebody is because I tend to go off into the depths of everything that I've come to terms with, but sort of forget that it may be worth noting the thresholds that I passed and crossed along the way that made things more obvious in this process. So good morning to you.
Good morning. So I have so many questions, and but I think I want to bring you back to what you said on Sunday, which is a question you answered was if you, Jack, were to write a book, it was not my question, but it was a very good one. If you were to write a book, Jack, what would the title be? And you had that ready to go, being on time, which is clever. It has the whole wordplay that you love, double meaning, on and on. But my follow-up question to that is, what is the thesis statement? That's usually one sentence of this potential being on time book.
I would say as a spiritual view of life on earth.
Okay, that let me write that down. A spiritual view of life on earth. Okay, I'm going to use your words against you. Do you
Please.
do you believe that everyone, let me back up. What you bring to the table, is it fact or belief?
Well, if truth is true, then I would say that's a fact, and I don't need to believe in it for it to be.
So I think
And
this is where you're going to run into some trouble because, like A Course in Miracles, people will have, and I am not a fan of The Course in Miracles. There's some fundamental things with that text that I do not align with. It doesn't sound right to me. It doesn't feel right to me. It's like quoting the Bible. It's like, well, you're not going to get my buy-in if that's where you're starting or that's where you're referring to. So I think fundamentally, if you are bringing to the table being on time, is a spiritual view of life on earth, but in order to digest what I'm about to say in this book, you have to come from the same premise and belief system that I'm coming from, which is fine. We can do that. Um, but that definitely limits when we talk about the steps and recovery and thinking, it limits buy-in, for lack of a better word.
Well, that's the whole point, is that we actually think we have to understand it, believe for it to be true, when in fact, if it's true, we don't need to believe in it at all for it to be true. We've been thinking in these relative terms and using thinking in a rational, logical way to conclude reality and truth, when in fact, reality and truth existed before the first thought ever occurred. If it's true and real, it's not something that just started when humans began thinking, because there was a universe here functioning in the way it was functioning, sufficient to be able to allow us to be here to function today and talk about it. So I don't ask any faith at all. As a matter of fact, I think that the ideas of faith and hope and trust and belief have all been perverted, because I've had faith in my thinking and it's never paid off wholly. And I've had trust in my thinking when it wasn't always trustworthy. And I've had hope that someday, somehow, somewhere, somewhen, it'll come true. The more and more and more and more and more and more and more I think about it, and it never has. When in fact, it's given me all the evidence I needed eventually to say, wait a minute, all the conflict I'm running into isn't life. It's what I'm thinking about life that's conflicted, that I'm experiencing, but I'm blaming life because the addiction turns everything backwards. It's addiction is a lie effectively, and a lie only operates on the basis of it being true. As long as we think it's true, it's a lie. As long as we admit it's a lie, it's no longer a lie. So the
I
freedom
think
from the
I want.
thinking, what's that?
Oh no, you go ahead.
The freedom from the thinking is to begin to align what we're doing and notice that the greatest impact of our on our experience is what we're actually doing and responsible for. And it's misdoing and mistaken ideas that we're perpetuating that are not utilizable because they're not applicable to actual reality, but the supposed reality we create while posing as the creator of reality by making believe our thoughts are truth and reality. And thus, anything we think creates a world that we live in and wonder why we feel alone. I mean, it's like simultaneous, it happens immediately because our sensory awareness is based in, if there's anything absolute, the basis of our existence is absolute. So my body would be designed to tell me what's wrong. Otherwise, it would have been designed to completely self-destruct before it was even created, because there would have been no need for an organism to actually survive. The whole impulse of organisms seems to be towards survival, doing the best they can to do the best they can to continue doing whatever they can.
And I was able to follow 90% of that. That's a huge improvement.
You've been a big help. Just having you sitting there and knowing that there's a critical eye willing to challenge and contest what I'm thinking has really made a difference to me, Tara, and I really appreciate it, because I've talked to a lot of people, and I'm sure that I go out on a limb and just presume they're going to get where I'm talking and forget that they're already where we're already there. That having the confidence that if there's any absolute source, that it's absolutely the source of everyone everywhere, and not only everyone everywhere, but everything everywhere, and everything between the things. Also, the space that we think of as having nothing in it is also filled with, and absolutely part of that totality of potential that we're talking about and thinking about.
Yeah, and when you relate it to addiction so quickly, um, I have to track back to what it was like before I have had some years of being sober. So it, you know, I like to apply it to my life today, and then I can
Yes.
track back to the crazy. But I can get to what you're saying, I have to kind of dig into memories that it's a little bit of a leap for me when you go there, but not that I don't have the experience to draw on. A few months ago, I regularly donate blood. And not because I'm awesome or a good person, but because it doesn't bother me. And I have O positive and they like that blood. It's a common one. It's whatever, semi-universal, I don't know. So there's this day and I got to give blood and I scheduled it in advance and I'm just not wanting to go. Like, just not, I don't want to do it. And I prep before I give blood. I eat a lot of spinach. I drink a lot of water. I don't, because I've had experiences in the past where I donate blood and then I'm out the whole next day. I'm just groggy. So this day, I'm dreading having to give blood all day. I get a call from the blood bank and they say, you cannot donate because a car ran into the building and we have to shut down. And I thought, all right, I'm okay with that. So the ongoing joke is that God made this car run into the building so I don't have to donate. That's ridiculous. And I understand that, but that's kind of just being, cheeky. But the next 2 days, and this is the point of the story, I was under the weather, not sick, but exhausted. Had I given blood that day, I 110% my reality would have been, I feel this way because I gave blood. There's no doubt in my mind. I wouldn't have even considered that wasn't the cause, but I didn't give blood. For Saturday and Sunday, it was a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, I was just useless, not sick, but feeling like I'd given blood. So my point in this whole story is that it's an example of our thoughts creating our reality, the reality in which we live in, right? That false private mental state of whatever is.
which
And
isn't reality.
it's not reality, but that's like saying a dream isn't a dream. So
Exactly. No,
we
no,
can,
no. It's saying a dream is a dream.
well, sure. Here's the thing. Let me tangent from that. So you've heard of a lucid dream, and even if you haven't, Jack, I know you enough now that you'll say you have. So you're like my husband. He never says no, he doesn't know anything. He says, "Oh yeah, huh," and then he'll look it up and come back and act like he knew it all along. But I'm guessing you've heard of a lucid dream. For anybody listening that hasn't, it's having a dream where you are able to do things. You realize it's a dream, and so you can control the dream. And
Hmm.
there's practices to have the ability. People have come up with successful practices to have
Yes.
lucid dreams. And I
Yes.
learned this from my adult son when he was in high school. He was doing this. You wake up and you journal about the dream you have, and you're constantly journaling. So here's the thing. I've never done the practice, but I have the gift. I believe it's a gift to have lucid dreams. And I often have lucid dreams when I get to fly. So I am having my dream no matter what. But when I realize I can change my thinking about my dream, thus having a lucid dream, I get to fly and it's badass. It is so much
Yes.
fun to fly. So if we use that example and apply it to our waking hours,
Yes.
we can then have lucid waking hours where we're aware that reality is not really reality, but we can.
No, no, no. Reality is really reality. You're starting to distinguish the fact that you can be aware of the influence you have in reality, like real reality, like the actuality of reality, rather than the supposed reality coming out of the dream state. You were talking about the one thing that qualified that dream as being loose is that you knew it was a dream.
True.
When
Yes.
I think I'm awake and what I'm awaking in is my reality, I'm not awake. I'm put to sleep by the idea that I'm creating reality rather than I'm already in reality. I'm already the sum total of reality. I'm already the essence of reality. For me to think of it as my reality because I think it up is to miss the fact that I'm creating an illusion and calling it reality. That's what a dream is.
Yeah, and I think
So if a,
maybe
if a
maybe
dream
I'm
if a dream is a dream, there's no conflict in that because you see it for what it is. And now you have the potential to utilize it and have fun with it. That's not a nightmare. The nightmare is when we think the dream is reality, and all of a sudden we're being chased by goblins and ghouls and things down hallways that never end. That distinction is very, very important to what we're talking about, because it's exactly what happens during the day when we feel life is impossible and life is a nightmare, because we're literally creating the dream and thinking it's reality. That's the whole point of the obsessive thought. The obsessive thought thinks it needs to constantly think, because the reality it seems to be creating is born of thought, not reality. There is no shortage of reality that ever needs to be augmented by additional thought.
I
What
think
we're
we're saying the
doing,
same thing.
we are, but we're using slightly different terminologies that's worth noticing. What we're doing is manifesting effects. That's what brains do. They manifest effects like ripples on a pond. We don't create the pond, we don't create the water, we throw a pebble and it creates a ripple. We're creating effects within the
Agreed.
context of reality. So now when I do that, I put my mind at ease, my brain at ease, because it's no longer trying to create reality. It's now just creating effects within reality, because the cause of my thinking always creates an effect. And if I make believe my thinking is real, I think the effect should only be what I imagine them to be and hope them to be and wish they would be and have faith in them as being and trust them to be. And they never seem to be that. So I live this dismal, conflicted, mentally anguished, emotionally anguished, seeming life. It isn't. It's self-imposed, self-induced by a self that's literally born of thought, not reality at all. It isn't who we are. It's simply what we're thinking.
Agreed. Could not agree more.
So now, but you see, the language changes a little bit. Like we can,
Well,
I,
I think you get caught up on the language. You like to have an argument about semantics, but I don't I'm not quite ready to entertain a debate on semantics, but sure. So I
let me ask you a
say
question though. If
I
you
say our
think, if you
perception.
think, if you think your imagination is reality, that isn't a semantic argument. You're claiming that your imagination is reality, as though reality is deficient until you imagine it.
Fair enough.
Think of that.
Yeah, no, fair
Think
enough.
of
But
that.
I think what I love about the quote, "Your perception is your reality,"
It
is that
isn't though.
what? Hold on. The what I love about the quote, "Your perception is your reality," is in that quote, it's very obvious to anybody that's paying attention is that your reality's fucked up because it's not accurate.
Yeah, it's insanity.
So I think you're taking the reality, the literal sense, your perception is your reality. Obviously, if your perception is your reality and everybody has a different perception, we're all living in a make-believe reality. But so I get what you're
Only,
saying is you're getting
only,
caught up on the word reality, but it's the difference between being aware of our thoughts and the way they impact our life and not being aware of our thoughts and the way they impact our life, and then go the other way, go the opposite way. Life is peaceful. Life is not chaos. It's all peaceful. It's all beautiful. It's all well aligned. Your wrong thinking, your lack of awareness of that is what's causing the conflict with what is.
well, I wouldn't say it's a lack of awareness. I would say it's a lack of thoughtfulness. And again, to the point of words,
Again, you're arguing about semantics. So I'm saying awareness, you're saying thoughtfulness.
but if in mathematics we're calling it semantics to say 2 + 2 is 4, and we could insert any other number in there and still come up with 4, we would be wrong. And largely humans have been fighting over what you're calling semantics, because the idea that reality is reality has been so bifurcated and segregated and individualized that people don't seem to even recognize reality as reality, not for me, but for everyone, everywhere, and everything everywhere. To
Okay.
begin to stabilize that is to begin to notice that there's something significantly broader than the human context of thought. And
Okay.
thought
So
has led to language, and language was defined. Language is a definition of things, not to sum total their absolute nature, but to simply reference them in terms that would be sufficient to convey information that would be worth digesting. And our functional literacy is dependent on some level of understanding what we're talking about, if we have any potential to talk about it at all, because we already know it. What you're suggesting is that silence would be the ultimate highest point for humans. And I would agree, if we were functioning off of an absolute state of knowing, we wouldn't be talking as much about all the divisions of what we think. We would simply be looking and saying everybody's going to think what they want, but the goal here is the same. And that is to support each other and to create and produce and thrive rather than just simply survive and exist.
So back a few paragraphs, we were going back and forth about awareness and thoughtfulness. And I
Yes.
agree, they are different. I take back what I said. I wrote it down, I looked at the words, but we have to first be aware of the basic concepts and power of our thoughts before we can actually be thoughtful about them. Agreed?
Well, except that if you're thinking from a lack of awareness in an absolute sense and thinking your thought about awareness, about a thought that's unaware, is going to feed it anything more but information about what you're not aware of, you're
Okay, there's
missing.
absolutely no listeners that followed any of that.
Okay. If you're thinking from the thinking standpoint, you're once again regurgitating the, if the thinking is corrupt to begin with, and you think what that corrupt thinking needs to do now is become aware of itself, what it's becoming aware of is the corruption of the thinking stagnating as a result of the repetition of thinking about thinking about thinking, rather than seeing that the actual fresh water, the thing that avoids stagnation and turning water to poison, that's elementary to our success to live, is an inflow of new fresh water. And if the moment is new, if the presence is new, if there's an absolute infinite present state of awareness that's new, that's knowing, that is yours and mine and everyone else's and everything else's natural state.
I, I'm still gonna, we can agree to disagree. I believe we cannot change the false reality we live in without becoming aware of the power of our thoughts.
Okay. So I want you to spend more time thinking about that and
I
see
want
how
you to
well.
spend more time thinking about that.
I have. I've done it
Because
long enough to find that it never worked. It never will work because it's thinking trying to create reality rather than submit
it's
itself and
not thinking trying to create reality. It's not. You get, when you have somebody, I have a friend of mine, love her. Her reality is the world is against her and everything in life is hard.
but it isn't her reality. It's her
Her
choice.
thoughts feed that reality. Her thoughts
No,
are,
no.
the world
Her
she
choice,
lives in is
her
fed
choice
by
to
her thoughts. Hold on,
her
I have to launch. Her thoughts are constantly in a negative loop.
of
And
course.
she's never going to get out of that negative loop until she's aware of her thoughts.
Okay. She's already aware of them. And the feeling that the world is against her is her awareness of the sickness of her thoughts.
I don't think she's aware of the power of her thoughts at all.
You just explained to me that she feels the world is against her. That's
That is correct.
she's creating that just like she would be creating an image in a mirror of a
Right, but I
horror
could tell her
film.
that, but she's not going to believe it until I give her examples with how her thinking is.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
those examples,
Exactly.
and that's the awareness of the power of your thoughts. You have to
Hang
start there.
tight.
Somebody
Hang
said,
tight. You're acting as though your words, like I occasionally act as though my words are the end all, which they aren't. They're just suggestions to consider. It's not until an individual decides that they have a problem with alcohol that they get sober. It's not because anybody tells them anything. They ultimately make that decision. Your friend, like you right now, has a choice to make as to whether or not the basis of your existence is what you think it is and what you need to do in thinking to either have it or not have it, or concede that your basis in existence is a basis that is shared by all in an infinite, absolute reality. Reality now, not a perception reality, not a manifest reality, not a thing of thought, but real reality that is not thinking at all because it knows everything. It doesn't have anything to think about. It's so profound that we get scared even imagining it because it threatens all the thoughts we have about reality. Her witness, her awareness is in fact the conflict, the
I
stress.
disagree.
I
I
know you
disagree.
do. That's
Because
why we're
there
talking.
is no awareness. There is
Yes,
no
there is.
awareness
Her
that
awareness is in fact
it's
the
like me,
consequence.
it would be like me having donated that day. And then Saturday and Sunday, I am saying the reason I'm not feeling well is because I donated on Friday.
I got
So
it.
I'm not aware at all that I'm wrong as shit. I'm not aware at all that there's a possibility that it was something else.
Well, you
Because
think that though, Tara, because you rely solely on your thinking. So you think when you don't think you know something, you don't know something, and you're committing to it right now. You're absolutely hammering down further that when you don't think it's happening, it's not happening. Let me suggest
that's
something to
not
you.
what I said. That's not what I said. I said that on Saturday and Sunday, the only explanation that's possible that even dawns on me in my thinking is that I feel this shitty because I donated blood. Period. End of story. No more
So let me,
consideration, no more intuition, no more thought given to the matter. And
here,
then I may not donate 8 weeks later because it made me sick last time. And so
no, I
then
get,
on and on
listen,
I go.
I get the twisted nature of this. I get the way it sets off into all these other directions. I get that human history is littered with this thinking. Our whole history is twisted in millions, trillions of different ways that try to justify that there's nothing else we can do but what we've been doing, and that's it. But let me suggest to you that day that describe to me that premonition you had about giving blood. Describe to me the feelings you had.
I did not want to give blood that day.
Right. But there was
I had
something
other
else to
things
it.
to do. I had other things to do. I was busy. I had kid stuff. I had
But
work
you
stuff. It was bad
seemed to
timing.
me that you developed a feeling though prior to that. There was something that seemed ominous about it, something that didn't fit right, didn't feel right.
I mean, I'm breaking down the reasons why I just didn't want to do it. I'm like, I just
No, I
couldn't.
know, I know. What was your experience though? Your feelings.
I didn't want to do it
Right. That's analytical.
because I had too much to do.
Yeah. So could it be that you had a premonition that you didn't belong there, that you shouldn't go there, that you had an awareness that something was wrong, and that you knew better than to pursue that wrongness because everything you did to shake it in terms of your commitment, it kept staying on course. I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it in all these different ways. Something didn't feel right about it. Something felt wrong. You had an awareness that you're thinking of only in relation to, I didn't want to do it. And I never would have seen this if I hadn't done that and been sick the next 2 days or weak the next 2 days, because I thought it would have been the blood. And you're beginning to admit how quickly we come to conclusions that are absolutely not true and live as though we are and wonder why we feel conflicted on a regular basis and think we have nothing to do with it, think we're totally uninvolved in it. That's really revealing the depth of my contention is that we don't struggle with what we're thinking. We struggle largely with what we think we're not thinking. And that's where the real bonus and the real potential begins to open up because there's so much going on in our analytical process that we don't give credit to at all, that we think we have nothing to do with. Think of the trillions of things your body is doing on a daily basis to even allow you to want or not want to give blood. And yet we don't think about those things until something hurts, until something feels wrong. Our extrasensory perception has been dumbed down to think all that's happening is what we're thinking is happening, not what's absolutely happening. So I would give you credit for having a sense of knowing that day not to go there for reasons other than you might have thought were the right reasons, because you had a sense of knowing that became clear to you about it. And I would say that conceding that is beginning to concede this knowing awareness that is aware of what's going on beyond the horizon. We talk like sailors who used to think the horizon was doomed because so they stayed away from it and never approached it until they did and realized that all those islands that were beyond it and all those continents and all those people were always there the whole time, and that you can never reach the horizon as you move toward it. It moves with you as you move toward it on a sphere. And we treat thoughts that way. The limit of my thought is all there is. It's my reality. I can't get beyond it. I have to know that I have to get beyond it to get beyond it. But the idea that there's something to get beyond when it's simply an illusion is the insanity of making believe somehow it'll get better by reinforcing it and thinking I'm going to develop it in a direction that does anything other than bring the contamination of that initial thought with it. This idea that we're creating reality is a major, major flaw in the thinking we're doing, just like the dream you described. I've never thought of them as lucid dreams, but I have those dreams where when I get really quiet, I know that I start to lift off. My when my knowingness starts to become obvious, I start to float, and I can direct the floating I do. I can guide that floating, and I'm very much aware that I'm doing that, and it's very fun. It's not a nightmare at all because I know it's a choice. I know that I'm allowing it to happen within my experience. It isn't reality, it's just an effect I'm creating. And yet, if it was an effect I was creating and thinking I was in the dream, I have a typical fear of heights. When I get on man-made heights, I don't feel very comfortable. I would feel afraid to be at those heights and not fall, but I never have that fear when I'm doing it in a dream that I know is a dream, but I always have it when I think I'm in a dream that isn't a dream, that is reality. And so you described it very well, though, because that is the daydream. There's a great Russian philosopher, I think his name is Gurdjieff, that says humans are asleep dreaming they're awake. And that's the daydream that turns into a nightmare. The idea that an illusion and a thought, which is basically just imagery in our brain, becomes reality is a huge leap in claiming there is no other reality. That's a major traumatic experience to have a being begin to even witness that they would subject their physical incarnation of a possible expression of life to the idea that they don't have any existence whatsoever until they make it up and then try to perfect it in relation to all other things rather than see it already exists and it's unified and it's already the sum total of everything that we are. It isn't a debatable, negotiable option if
So
it exists.
I align with all of that. I have no counter argument, but I have a question. So all of that we'll start with the premise that all aligns with the listeners and with me, but we still have that my friend listening that the world is against her and she's not buying what we're saying. Much like somebody said, well, I don't have lucid dreams. I want to have a lucid dream. And somebody came up with this technique of, hey, write down all of your dreams, every detail, keep a notebook by your bedside. And every time you wake up from a dream and you remember a dream, even if it's the middle of the night, write down your dream. And this practice will help you have more lucid dreams.
Right.
Okay. So my question for you is, what is a technique or a tactic or a something we can give or provide this friend of mine who lives in this really negative world that's against her? What's a technique?
I wouldn't suggest a technique to try to fix something that's broken and is insane, because it would be insane to engage around an idea
How do
that,
you make her uninsane? How does somebody
well,
how does somebody work with her?
she's not insane by nature. She's insane by the choice she's making, exactly as I've been describing, to make believe that her
Yeah, but that's like
thoughts are.
telling an alcoholic or an addict
Hang
just
on, hang
want
on.
to stop.
Let's just think it's you and I here rather than her. We're
Okay.
trying to figure out what some other people won't do while we're not doing it here. So let's just do it here first and start to see if that doesn't have some intuitive direction in terms of what might be possible with others. If she's creating, or I am creating, let's say I'm creating the idea that my thoughts are real. I'm creating the idea that I am the creator of the universe. Now, the world isn't actually against me, but the world I am creating is against the idea that there is anything other than my thought. Why wouldn't I naturally feel, as I said earlier, the effect she's witnessing, if looked at accurately by the words she's using, are describing the fact that she's created a world that is in complete opposition to reality and truth by claiming it is her own reality and her own truth in her own world, and wondering why the world seems against her because she's not thinking it's her creating the thought. She's literally thinking she's creating reality. She's not just saying, oh, I'm having a thought, it's creating an effect. The effect is obviously creating the opinion and the idea that I'm not, that the world is against me, because the world I've created is against the whole concept of there being a world and there being a universe and there being any other reality than the one I'm creating. She's actually reflecting a perfect image of the thought she's having while thinking it's something happening to her because she doesn't want to be responsible for the thought she's doing. She's going to think it's happening to her. And when I think I'm irresponsible for the thought, I think it's happening to me very conveniently so that I can claim the irresponsibility for it. And then I think I don't have anything to do with it. And the next thought is there's nothing I can do about it. That's a loop
Agree.
of insanity.
So how
So,
do one get out of the loop?
well, you and I sitting here right now is to notice the loop doesn't exist other than a delusion thought to be real, just like the nightmare doesn't exist other than when a dream is thought to be real. The
And
night,
so,
the dream isn't a nightmare. When you think it's a dream, you say, wow, I can do whatever I want. Now think of this in a dream state. We can start doing what we want. It's exactly what we have possible during the day. Walking on earth, it's the same possibility, but what do we think? Oh, that's impossible. I can't do that. We won't do that. They don't do that. They're never going to think that. We seem to have perfect clarity in what everybody else isn't going to do to justify us not doing the exact same thing we're claiming they don't want.
so what I hear you saying is that talking about it and giving insight into the loop can help somebody see that the loop exists.
I think it's even more fundamental than that, Tara. It gets back to the silence. Is that when I start knowing I know, my presence changes the presence that I present to other people and that I offer other people because it gets much quieter and people become much more receptive. And I can't really do anything about that in language at all because it isn't until they feel that connection and say, maybe there's something more than what I'm thinking. And they start having those thoughts. And when you give them the space by having the absolute alignment with reality, rather than thinking I need to think about it, it's the thinking I've been doing that I thought was creating it that was giving me the impression I was not aligned with it. And as I start seeing thinking for what it is, I can oppose everything anytime I want. I know that. And I know when I feel like everything is opposing me, that I'm having thoughts, even if I don't think I'm having them, that are creating that effect. It's not reality doing it because reality doesn't cause me to do anything wrong. Reality is the constant nature of everything in the universe functioning so well as to allow us to do anything at all, which means we can do everything, which is why we're free to think what we want. If we're
So
free to think what we want and end up thinking we're condemned, we are choosing thoughts that have no basis to create that impression. And to start seeing that is to go, oh, I have been choosing this all along. I'm not an innocent bystander at all. And to see that is to dispel a lot of the rumors that I would create about what I need to do for other people to save them when I'm not even doing it in my own experience, to realize it's insanity to imagine the insanity can be straightened out by giving it credit enough to think there's something I can do about it as though it even exists. It doesn't exist. It has no basis. It's
so
an effect being caused.
okay, my turn. So you said in that, and you elaborated on that, that there's a, so let me first share where I'm trying to come from. So I'm trying to help you create a book that is a spiritual view of life on earth. But in order to give that spiritual view, I would suggest that there are some fundamental techniques or information, even if that technique is to ponder this paragraph or ponder this sentence for a week. Just ponder. That's a technique. That's an action. That's a actionable item. I can read it and walk away and be like, I'm going to ponder that my thoughts are not reality. I'm going to ponder. I'm going to see if I can be aware. And you had said we need to stay, when you're in your explanation there, you're talking about yourself seeing thinking for what it is. And so I feel like there is a, a way, if the end state, right? So in change management, we talk about creating change in something. And we start with the end state. So the end state, end result, what we want, the thesis of this book is to provide people a spiritual view of life on earth. So if that's the end state, I'm trying to backtrack us to get people our current state. We're aligned on the current state. The current state is people's thinking is fucked, and it has nothing to do with the true reality and love as love is. And I would think that you're saying too that people are not recognizing or appreciating or aware of their intuitive state. They ignore it, they don't give it credit, they don't listen to it, insert whatever. So I'm trying to get us to actionable items to get to the end state.
Okay.
We can't force somebody to see thinking for what it really is, but I would like to
Nor do we
talk
need to.
through some things that we can do. And that's why one of my early questions to you was, how did you get to where you are today? So this, all of my questions for you are me trying to fill in the space, in state, current state. I am probably more at the end state than I realize, but I still have a lot of false thinking that I need to clean up between here and there, or that I would like to be aware of.
Right.
Um,
Well,
so
one of them, Tara, that we've crossed a few times today, and I don't think it's quite taken, is that the experiences we create, these manifestations that we create, the effects, the anxiety, the stress, the mental anguish, the discontent, the inner conflict, the disorders, are all absolute mirror images of the disordered, anguished, conflicted thinking we're doing. So when you say people aren't aware of it, what I'm saying is they're absolutely aware of it, but because it's coming from an addictive thought, an insane thought, they insanely determine that it has nothing to do with them and everything to do with everything else other than them. So when you can start seeing that, you'll start saying, when she says, the world is against me, and you can't talk her out of it because all she hears from you are words to defend that rather than recognize how offensive it is in her own thinking. Right? So she's going to take your words and only hear of your words what she wants to hear to continue to support the contention, just like I do and just like you do, I would suggest. If we're built on the same platform of everything right, we basically dysfunction in the exact same way, but think of it different because we have the freedom to put different words to it in times and places and faces and circumstances. That doesn't make it different. People have cancer, for instance. Doesn't matter that they live in different places and have different bodies and get up at different times and have different jobs and all that stuff. There's a thread that we accept is consistent between them. So to start to see the manifestation of dis-ease is an accurate, that we wouldn't feel dis-ease if we didn't know better. And to think that it's happening to us and something we can't control is, again, this insane idea that a lie can someday be true. So I'm just going to continue to repeat it and say I have nothing to do with it. It's not me. Rather than say we're not even using our thoughts properly and wondering why things go so wrong in our experience, not just yours and mine, but everyone's, because we're really affected by what everybody's doing, not just what you and I are doing. It's what you and I are doing with what everybody's doing that causes the greatest impact in our own experience, but it also reciprocally feeds back into that system, either anxiety and stress and disease as a contagion, as a virus that can't seem to be let go of, or if it is, you never get rid of it in your body and treat the symptoms, which is what we do. We try to always feel better about what's wrong rather than say, why would I want to feel better about something that's wrong? If I wasn't trying to outrun it and get away from it and think of it in terms that are oppressive and contemptful. It's my thinking about it that gives me that impression rather than saying, wow, this is giving me a perfect curriculum of what it is I'm thinking that's wrong. And I keep not wanting to read the chalkboard. I keep failing the test over and over again, wondering why I can't graduate, can't move on to the next class, can't make any progress. In the ultimate sense, I'm not talking about being able to take little steps forward and get a little better here and there because of that infinite awareness. If we consider it in any way, it improves things in every way. But to begin to consider it as something, you use ponder, I'm saying consider, same thing, just to sort of, that's a contemplative ability. We think about our thinking. Animals don't do that. That's what distinguishes us. But if the thinking about our thinking has created a self we think we are that isn't who we are because it's thinking of itself, That's a major traumatic episode to make believe that somehow or another we're the responsible parties to create, that we've created ourselves, that there's nothing more than us, and we're alone in the universe to fend for ourselves. The loneliness is an automatic byproduct of that thinking because the thought has no substance to it. It has no denominator to it. So it can never, we can pile on the numerator all kinds of new ideas and all kinds of new techniques, but that denominator is going to nullify it all. It's never going to make any difference. And we're going to think the effort, the blood, sweat, and tears is going to someday pay off. It won't.
I will ponder, I will consider that.
Well, and the other things, Tara, that's occurred to me too, in my own inefficiency and my own ineffectiveness and my own critical analysis, is that I am probably too wordy to grasp the understanding aspect of it. And yet, I've also found, as I talk about this, a lot of people say, I feel something's right about it. I just don't understand it, like we started with. There's a sense of knowing that they start to notice, but they're really thinking that because they don't understand it, that sense of, they're discounting the sense of knowing in the name of not understanding, which again shows how quickly we use thinking as our source rather than the spiritual understanding that we have, that isn't an understanding because it isn't a process. It isn't an analytical thing that we come to terms with. It's something that we can't not know. So I misspoke in terms of understanding. That knowing nature is knowing. It isn't thinking. So we know we know. So my sense is when I have a premonition something's wrong, I often attach to all sorts of things to justify the wrong I'm feeling rather than say something's wrong. And I might not want to act as quickly as I normally would on the things I think I need to do right now, but pay attention to that wrong and be aware of it. Just know there's some kind of knowing awareness that's telling me something's up. I might not want to step in that direction and start to see that guidance system is perfect. It's always been perfect. And we've dumbed it down in the name of constantly think we're going to return to thinking to solve it rather than see there is no solution in it because there's absolutely no problem in it. There's nothing to fix because there's nothing broken. Now, if I start contemplating that, it starts to become expansive. It's very hard to maintain obsessive thoughts when I'm sincerely, and I say sincerely because a lot of people will say, well, yeah, I thought about it and I just don't believe it. And that's, they thought about it and were over it and made a decision and went back off, launched back off into that same addictive pattern. So my experience with people is to say, if you like the thinking you're doing, you're going to maintain it. And if you don't like the consequences you're getting as a result of that, it's because of the thinking you're doing you don't want to think you have anything to do with. So in one respect, you say you like it. This is why we say we love our addictions. I love drinking. I loved Coke. Think of that. We love things that are killing us. How insane is that? We end up thinking that we love them and, well, I love it too much to stop. Big Book says that. Think in the sixth step, Bill talks about that. There's some things we just don't want to give up. But
Which
if we
reminds me
admit,
of the quote, when you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, we have some steps for you.
yeah, and my sense is that we're sick, we're admitting that, but we're not tired enough to stop. The sick, if we keep doing it, we're not tired. We keep drawing on the adrenaline and we keep bankrupting our body's ability to continue by utilizing things in the name of sickness becoming true one day. And we're literally exhausting our body and its resources and killing ourselves early in the name of trying to prevent dying, trying to avoid it. So this concept starts with us in just looking. Nothing has to be agreed to. But anything that I continue to perpetuate in my own thinking, and I assure you that I have levels of thinking I don't even think I'm thinking, cultural ideas and creeds and mores that have been passed down through the ages that seem so typically common that I would not even think to think about them right away. But how I notice them are in those effects that you described your friend witnessed. When I have that feeling that the world is just a sorry place and it's never going to be fixed, I'm having that feeling based on the culmination of all my thinking, not just the thinking I think I'm doing, that is actually lonely and I'm not willing to fix because I'm not willing to admit I'm the one breaking it. And when I start seeing that, it's nothing I have to fix. To think of it being fixable is to think of it being something that actually needs fixing, as though it's a thing. I'm giving it credit as reality, rather than say, no, this is insanity. If I engage with insanity, I become insane all over again in some new way and think I'm not.
Well,
The
that's a
fantasies.
great use case right out of the mouth of Jack, right? So use case being a real life example. It's a term they use in corporate America. We need use cases so we can solve for them. So we get a bunch of use cases on here's all the different experiences that people have had. Now let's solve in case we run up to that use case, how do we resolve for it? So a use case here, and I'm sure I'm getting it wrong a little bit. That's my use of it as a change communication person. So use case here is Jack has all of this knowledge. He's done this studying. When you experience something other than complete love, you can step back. You said yourself, and I'm putting words in your mouth. You'll have to correct me. I'm sure you will. You step back and say, that's insane thinking. That can't be because this is a world of love. So that's one technique somebody could do. If you start thinking something other than pure love, you can pause and say, that's insane thinking. I'm not going to feed that anymore. All is
Well,
well.
so another division in that too, and you and I got into this last week, and I sort of called you back and said, I think I missed this point, is that the insanity doesn't come from the wrong thinking. If I'm looking out at the world and thinking about all the possibilities that are possible, I'm probably going to be wrong in some of the decisions, because if it was so obvious to me, it would be done. The thing I would be thinking about wouldn't be a question as to whether or not I could do it, or a question about whether or not I want to do it or should do it, because it would just be done. There would be no obstacle to it. It would just be done. So if I'm challenged by thing, I'm going to make a lot of wrong thoughts. The problem isn't the wrong thoughts. It's thinking they're right, that this log jam starts. It's immediately concluding that anything I conclude is right immediately. So what I know, and how I started to, two things I started to do. I started to admit I know more than I think. That was one of the first big bridges. Just starting to say I know more than I think. So I started relying on my knowledge rather than my thinking primarily. And by doing that, the craziness of the thinking started to become smaller, because I just started seeing it as something I was doing rather than something I felt consumed by being. Because when I think my thoughts are reality, I think I'm now in my thoughts, because I think I become my thoughts. So I have no perspective whatsoever, which is that blind spot that Bill Wilson talked about. I'm in it. That's why I go drink. I go do the thing that I absolutely know better than to do, because I claim I have no perspective and I can't see and all that kind of stuff. But I've chosen that role by making believe who I am is what I think. When I start saying I know more than I think, all of a sudden the witness of knowing becomes huge, and the thinking just becomes something I'm doing in my brain, just like if I was waving to people all the time and wondering why, first of all, I can't do anything else with my hand, but not everybody waves back and not everyone waves the same way. And I'm always waving, and why don't they wave back to me? And why don't they, and all that kind of stuff. It's just something I'm doing. If we do it externally, it seems silly to talk about it. But when we do it internally, we've got such a complex web of things that we think we're doing that are hidden. But I realized there were no secrets at all in any of the things I was ever doing. I was, through blood, sweat, and tear, expressing them in all the defective ways I was treating other people and thinking about other people and interacting in my own experience, by dysfunctioning and thinking a lack of productivity was helping me prove that God didn't love me, that there was no God, that there was no place for me. All those, I was making them right within the rational, insane thinking that my scarce thinking was in fact right. So that's a transition, but it isn't one. The other thing is to begin to realize, well, I've always known that. If that knowing is absolute, I've always known it. And how insane do I have to be to make believe that I don't even know the greatest thing I potentially could know, and then act as though all I needed to do was work harder in my understanding to finally know everything, to prove basically that I should get the credit for this. I don't want to say thanks for the gift. I want to say I want the credit. which is what I was working for the whole time and still do to that degree, that those things become so prominent that I think wrong can be right. I want to prove I'm in charge, I'm right. And in this discussion, I'm doing what I can to say it isn't my words, it's what we end up doing with those words and our experience that impact us most. And if we all have a knowing nature that we share, that loving world you talk about may not be the world we're looking at with our eyes when we're not seeing a lot of love being expressed. But it is, in fact, the substrata of that world, regardless of the defective, sick expressions that we're creating. And in my experience, language is a very powerful tool to use to help people recognize and reckon with the things that they may be contorting in their brain in all these various ways, using words improperly to make believe that they're controlling reality, rather than start to see that words were defined specifically to give us a reference point for things, not to help confuse us, but to help orient us in a language that we could share in common, which is why languages are developed around cultures. They're not all the same. Some of them are foreign languages, but this ultimate language of a silent absolute knowing isn't in the kind of language that I think of in terms of words. It's in a present state of awareness that's at perfect peace and perfect quiet and perfect presence all the time. And if we know that, that's our gauge to clarify what we're witnessing that's wrong, because that wrong would feel fulfilled if it was allowing that loving nature to be expressed. There would be a fulfillment to it rather than some lack of fulfillment that constantly is looking for more and more satisfaction. So maybe those are a couple of points.
Yeah, it reminds me of I've mentioned before that I was a mom very young. I was 19 and the world told me I couldn't do it. And I raised my oldest son, who was the one who just called earlier. He's a calling and texting. He's 25 now. But when I was 19, he was born, and I raised him solely on intuition. I summed it up as my ancestors helped me raise him, but it was solely on intuition. I did what felt right around every corner. There was no internet in 1998. There was no, I mean, maybe there was. I didn't have access to the internet in 1998. I couldn't Google up the way things are now. Fast forward to 2012, I had my second son, and every time something happened, I would go to the internet and Google and read what other moms did. And I did the opposite of raising him on intuition. And it was so hard. Everywhere I turned, there was conflict. He wasn't sleeping, he wasn't eating, he wasn't this. And so my advice to every mother out there, when you go to a baby shower, they go around, what's your advice? Or you run into advice giving as a mom and a woman to other parents, is follow your intuition. You and your intuition about your baby is going to be stronger than any other advice that anybody gives you. Listen to your intuition at all turns of parenting. And I think that aligns nicely with what you're saying, is our intuition is love, guidance, truth, kindness, gentleness. It's not conflict, difficulty, blah, insert negative, blah, blah.
Right. And then the actions we take, the consequence, every thought. Here's something I believe we miss in sobriety, that thinking is a primary action, and no voluntary action is ever taken that isn't preceded by a thought. So voluntary actions are really effects of thought, just like feelings are effects of thought. And words are effects of thought. I'm doing my best to explain what I know, but it doesn't always come out right to be understood, because we all seem to have different ideas about what those words mean. And we've also been manipulating the words to make believe we could control reality, because reality is so often defined by humans in language, because that's something very specific that we do. So that awareness that you're describing is absolutely inherent to all of us. And the irony and the sad thing is, I mean, I have to take a breath, um, because the the sad thing is to actually be honest about it and to be accurate about it is to begin to witness the grief we've caused, not only in our own experience, but others, in the name of conspiring with them to make believe that we could support them in a way that was killing them and hurting them and harming them, or thinking we were doing the best thing when we weren't. And one way I learned in relation to this whole idea of the effects being a guidance system is that when I don't say I don't want the consequences, and as a result had nothing to do with them, I'm discounting the thought that manifests them by claiming I'm irresponsible for my own thinking. And I'm admitting it while thinking I have nothing to do with it. And when I think I have nothing to do with the thinking, what's the next thought? There's nothing I can do about it. I am stuck. I am forever screwed. I'm never going to get out of this. All
What
from
is the
one simple.
example? Yeah, I feel like you're pulling from an experience, but not
No,
sharing the
it's
experience.
the sum total of all of them. I mean, you were talking earlier about going back into memory and going back and going. You never go back. You're only drawing from the memory you have today about something that happened at some other time. It's always a present memory. But my sense is we've manipulated our memory to only remember the things that are convenient for us to remember. We remember them in ways that are preferential to the story we're telling, and we actually, that idea that life passes before our eyes at the last minute is the lie of karma, as far as I'm concerned, that we'll figure it out in the next lifetime, but we're going to screw it up in this lifetime. We're going to continue to screw it up because karma, as far as I'm concerned, karma is immediate and it's called effect. And the effect always occurs as a result of a cause. And if my thinking is the primary cause because it's a primary action that I'm choosing, very different than the knowing that's going on in my body that I don't think I'm choosing. But if I'm choosing thoughts that create anxiety, I am affecting all of those other bodily systems that I don't think I'm thinking about. And I'm having an impact on them that undermines their ability to even function. So the point is, when this occurred to me, it all occurred to me as being something that I had been that I'd been a party to the whole time. And what could be greater to mourn than spend time absolutely creating insanity and hurting and harming other people in the name of thinking I'm doing the right thing and the only thing? And my sense is that's the present traumatic state that gets passed on generation to generation, the generational trauma that gets passed on, thinking somehow we'll get better if we kick the can down the block, which is why we constantly talk about the kids being our future while we're not doing as well as we could to leave them a future that will have an earth to support them. We're doing horrible things. And I would claim we want to be doing those things because we're trying desperately to get our attention to see that we don't have to do any of those things. Just like somebody who finally says, I can't drink, I can't do this anymore. I just can't do it. It's a very different position to take than, you know what, I can do it a little bit today and find out that a little bit turns into a lot, and pretty soon it turns into 3 more years. That point at which we each come to say, wow, maybe I've been trying to do something with insanity that's insane to continue doing. And if I am, that would be a very sad thing to actually face, because I start to see the sum total of all the grief I caused and all the inadequacy I caused. I didn't realize how sad I was for all the things my daughter experienced until she died. And that was a very profound thing for me to realize. It wasn't just the things that I had tit for tat thought I was involved in along the way and left everything else to everyone else. It was the recognition that it was everything, the whole thing, all of it, the sum total of it I was involved in, regardless of whether it was immediate or direct or indirect or however I had rationalized it. And I thought that's interesting that death seems to be so revealing when in fact we think who we think we are is born out of thought. And there is no death possible in a self that doesn't exist. The only thing, and we're afraid to let that go. We're scared to death, my sense of living, because to live would be to let go of this idea that who we are is what we think. and actually face up to it, which is to face all the fears and all the sadness and all the mourning and all the grief and all the hate and all the loathsome things we've done in a moment, and realize that they vanish as soon as they're acknowledged. The weight goes away. The anchor, the alleged anchor, is no longer an anchor because it was never there, any more than the fear of flying would be a fear when you're absolutely aware that you're dreaming and absolutely have complete control over it because it's just what you're thinking. It's a very different experience. My sense is we're facing these things. Not, it's not an accident. Things are the way they are in the world right now. That we want these things to happen to get our attention, just on a global macro basis, the same way we do on an individual basis when it comes to struggling with any compulsion we have. We get sober alone, we stay sober together. And the window to see everyone as a potential benefit starts when we start thinking there's a common bond between us all, rather than the common bond is me getting my thinking straight and I'm never going to be able to live with everyone else until I do, and wonder why I keep getting older and it never happens. And I just get lonelier and bitter and hateful and spiteful and further distant, and die young for the sake of making believe this self we think we are is actual reality, rather than just thinking of itself. Certainly something we can do.
I'll think about that.
Yeah, I never, I was not one to cry, and I cry every day now, not out of pity, but some of it is awe, some of it is a release of stress and tension that I've held for a long time, as I start seeing things accurately and become accountable for them, and to notice that I have been accountable for them the whole time, but I have also counterbalanced that accountability with the denial of them, which is not actually accountable. But in one respect, it's happening accurately. In another respect, it's happening according to what I think, and the body tenses up. And what's interesting is inflammation is caused by constriction. The body starts to operate in the opposite direction, which is high blood pressure and all that kind of stuff, which I have had. Some people say it's genetic, and it may well be, because we have passed down body genes that have adapted to stress for generations, and we're inheriting those. So are we passing on bodies to the next generation that are filled with that stress right now, or are we passing on bodies that are much more aware physically of the potential capacity they have to function literally and literally? Functional literacy is actually reading the body languages and the effects of what's happening properly, and seeing that it's a perfect guide if we're reading correctly. But if we see the sign that says 20-mile-an-hour turn ahead and we think it says 200 miles an hour, we're probably going to run off the road. And if we see it as something we don't want to read, there's a good chance we're not going to act accordingly and align with it and do what we can to preserve the potential for more potential, rather than diminish that potential and wonder why diminished capacity seems to be our plight in life and our lot in life and all this kind of stuff.
What I'm hesitating on bringing up a new subject when we have about 15 minutes, but what this made me think of is intuition is available to all of us, but our society, at least here in America, is that females are more in tune with their intuition. But you mentioned passing down. It makes me think of, when the men had to go out and hunt for food to feed the family, the women are home taking care of the babies. This is generation after generation after generation. Women need to be able to read the safety of somebody walking up. They're nonverbal. They're walking up to the house. There's no man there. Men are out there hunting and gathering. So perhaps women may have passed down a stronger form of intuition, but it's available to all of us. And it should be, or it is a more peaceful spiritual life when we're connected with that intuition and following that intuition, that intuitive knowing, with our actions, whether thoughts preceded or not.
Yeah, and you're seeing in the world that There are whole swaths of women who are subjugated to subservient roles and that people are afraid of educating because it would threaten the dominance, the seeming dominance of men who are abusive if they don't obey them. Abusive to the point that women in those cultures that get raped get killed because they've dishonored the family, but they let the man live. Women don't ask to get raped. That's the point of rape. So it's always driven by a man, and yet the woman gets killed in an honor killing, not the guy. So that, my contention is that Adam ate the apple. It wasn't Eve. Well, think about it. Who ended up with Adam's apple stuck in their throats?
Well, my whole thing is Adam, excuse my colorful language, raped Eve, and that's the original sin. There's no fucking apple at all. He took the apple from Eve, and let's call a spade a spade. He
But
couldn't resist.
you could see how heretical changing that story is, and yet how consistently that story has been told. Men ended up with Adam's apple stuck in their throat.
I
I
mean,
would say
it's true.
I would
Go
say
back to your story.
choking on words, choking on the way we lie. What did Cain, I believe, said to God when he said, "Where's your brother?" I mean, here's the first two kids. One's a murderer, his brother's murdered. First two kids in history, according to the written human history. Doesn't mean it happened, doesn't mean it was true, but we've maintained the story. So it's emblematic of our belief systems. Cain kills his brother. God says, "Where's your brother?" Cain says, "I don't know." He's lying to God. Pretty good metaphor for the idea that we can create our own reality and not face any harmful effects. When the effects we're creating and the harm we're creating is only in our own experience, and because it's so insane to do it, we think everybody else is doing it to us. The key function of insanity is thinking it's sane. The key function to obsessive thinking is thinking a wrong thought is right or thinking a right thought is wrong. Once I have that belief and I have that faith in it and I trust it, I start operating on that basis as though there's nothing else I can do because it becomes my seeming reality when in fact it's simply a thought conflicting with a thought. So I can take something so simple as a thought conflicted with a thought. And if I was actually reading literally what was happening, I'd say there's a conflict here because I can feel the inner conflict. I'm up to something that isn't any good. I don't even have to know what it is to know in the immediacy that the inner conflict is telling me that. What does the book say? Whenever we are disturbed, something is wrong with us. What's wrong with us is how we're thinking, not about what's happening, but how we're thinking about what's happening. And it's not about what we're thinking, it's how we're thinking about that thing that's happening. What's happening is always happening as it's happening. What I think of what it's happening is very different than that. If I begin to just concede that my thinking isn't actually what's happening, I very quickly stop thinking about it as real and true and simply something I do. I can't be what I do. It starts to divest this idea that I am what I think I am, and all I need to do is think more and more about myself to fix it. What does that do? Just send me down that rabbit hole of making believe I can perfect something that's not only imperfect, it doesn't even exist. It's insanity. So, one thing I thought in relation to our discussions is that it may be defining the concepts of this in very simple ways because people are going to think about it the way they want to. And we can let them do that because they're already free to do that. So, it doesn't matter whether we let them or not, but it's a lot easier to go with how things are than how things aren't. Because basically, when I think things are only what I think they are, I don't think about things at all. I think about what I think they are, which means I'm not thinking about those things at all. So when I'm thinking about you as what I think, I'm not thinking about Tara. I'm thinking about my thoughts about Tara. So where are
What
you in that? There is no you in that. So it's all self-centeredness. It's all the idea that all I get is what I want, and all I get is what I think, and all I am is what I think. All that whole repetition of self-centered, selfish thinking. And there isn't even a self-centered in it. It's thinking centered on itself. Well, in fact, I've turned it into this whole impossibility of reality and making believe it's who I am, and everyone else is only what I see them as, and only what I hear from them is what I think they say. I don't even hear what they're saying, and wonder why there's conflict in my relationships.
which I think there's a need for open-mindedness in the preface. This
Well,
required.
here's another point too. Consider this intuition and this knowingness. This isn't something we do, it's just simply something we actually are. Intuition is defined as, if we want to get into semantics, knowledge beyond reason. What does it mean? There's no thinking, there's no reason for it whatsoever, there's no logic in it. It's preposterous to reason and rationale. Preposterous, because it undermines the whole point of reason thinking it's reality, when in fact, if reason is reasonable, it would start thinking reasonable rather than call things that are unreasonable reasonable. And we would stop saying things like, we witness things that happen and say, that's unbelievable. We just witnessed it. We just saw it happen and we say it's unbelievable. It shows how flimsy the whole concept of belief is in the face of experience. And we use it that way. And we talk about common sense. Well, that doesn't make sense. Common sense is the least common thing that humans have actually accomplished since the beginning of written history. Because it has been nonsensible to be thinking who we are is what we think. It's nonsense, meaning that all of our sensory capacities have been completely nullified and negated by making believe all we are is what we think. And all that is what we think. We haven't been thinking about the world at all. We haven't been thinking about each other at all. We've been thinking about what we've been thinking about each other. That is not who each other is. When I think what I'm seeing is what I think, I'm not seeing what is, I'm seeing what isn't as reality. That's insanity.
Agreed.
So now, if you're considering, and you would use the word ponder, the idea here is not to agree with anything or trust in anything or have faith or belief in any of it, but just begin to consider that if truth is true, it would be your truth and my truth and our truth simultaneously, rather than a self being myself, yourself, and ourself. Starts to divide. We start saying that we have a common basis already. It's already in play. It's already absolutely the reality. Reality is absolute. It doesn't need our help. We don't need to offer it up anything. We don't need to create our own reality to fill in the gap of reality, because there's no gaps in something that's non-dimensional and non-spatial, non-time bound. It's not in this dimension that we claim is the one we live in. And the irony is, only humans, back to your semantic thing, only humans have defined dimensions as separate. And so we think of ourselves as separate from the other dimensions, which means we don't think the infinite dimensions, which aren't dimensional, by the way, fit within the concept of what we think is reality. So even in science, we think we're in the first, second, third, fourth dimension. Fifth dimension starts to be something a little bit different that's unseen largely, except for the visible light that we see. Sixth dimension, as the dimensions grow, they all become infinite, which means they can't be dimensional at all. They're just a realm and we're trying to understand it and thinking rather than say, we already know what it is because it's operating in perfect order right now. If I come from knowing it, I might have a better sense of how to translate it, because I would intuitively know how to do things that I would never think of doing as a result of understanding.
This reminds me of, because everything that you share ever, I'm always thinking of an example or it just pops in my head. And this is, I recently read a statement by Glennon Doyle, who I adore. She was talking about not being able to conceive of a universe that doesn't end, that just continues to grow and grow. And I had the thought when I read that was, you can't think about it, you just have to know that that's just the way it is. You're thinking about it in a earth versus not earth. Like you're thinking of it as you're on earth or you're out in space. And so we can't, we don't have the words to
It's an either
understand
or.
it. So don't try to use words with your silent thoughts to understand it.
Well, your knowingness doesn't think. So it isn't what we do with it that's ever going to make a difference. It's the fact that we already have it that doesn't make any difference, because there is no difference in it. There again, you're starting to contemplate an absolute state. You realize there's no difference in it because it doesn't change. None at all. That completely defies the whole point of thinking, because thinking is always changing. So let me make a point too on this point, and we're going to end off so you can get to your call. Infinite has always been thought of as something that's constantly growing, 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 so it can always grow. But what occurred to me as I started noticing I have a greater sense of knowing and awareness was that anything that's growing is always limited wherever it is now. If it can grow from where it is, it must be limited right now, and that can't be infinite.
Fair enough.
And
Fair enough.
and,
Well
and
said.
thank you. And then forever never comes because I can wait forever and have forever to wait. And that is just a torture chamber of imagining someday, somehow I'll get there. So now start to consider that if the infinite is infinite, it is infinite now. It is infinite where we are. It is the presence of presence, that we are never out of the presence because we can't possibly, we can think we can defy and deny reality, but we never do. We just live in a seeming world that seems distinct from reality and has none of the benefits of reality, which are infinite. And all of a sudden, we think scarcity is the normal state of life. It isn't. The presence is present, not because it's growing, but because there is nowhere for it to grow because it doesn't operate in a spatial bound. That other forever is operating still within a third and fourth dimension of space and time, dimensionally based. This is now saying the present is present, and I will suggest something to ponder. There is no time in the present. People say there is no time like the present because there is no time in the present. The infinite nature of the present is that it's always new, so it has no end. And something that has no end cannot be on a time continuum because it always has a beginning and an end in terms of time, just like change always starts and stops. So the present of our nature, when you begin to contemplate this, and as you were just describing the woman, you can contemplate that forever too. But that used to haunt me. I heard of somebody dying at 5 years old, and I went to bed thinking of somebody being in a coffin forever, and it haunted me because I started grasping forever is forever is forever. And the more I thought about it, the more there was to wait, and it was just impossible. But the present nature, I can't consider this present nature as being absolute and start to actually ponder what absolute means because there are no exceptions to it whatsoever. And it doesn't matter what I think, it still is what it is as it is now. And it is also what everything is, the essence of everything and everything between everything and everything beyond what we think is everything, because it would get into the nothingness of all things and beingness in the ultimate sense. You can't have obsessive thoughts in that contemplation and consideration if you're sincere about it. They just start to dissipate. Why? Because we're witnessing something that isn't bound by space. And all of a sudden, the little bit of space that thoughts take up do not amount to much of a world at all. they, they are a speck on a speck on a speck, just like the world is a speck on a. If you ever seen our world from outside the solar system, it does not look like anything but a tiny star. And that's from outside the solar system. If you get further, it disappears completely. So those are all metaphoric for this idea that if I think my thoughts are all that matters, I think my thoughts are the gravitational pull of the universe, centering everything that's happening and creating a world. And so I'm actually creating the mass and the matter to justify that everything is pulled toward it and I'm at the center of it, when in fact the weight of that is depressing me because it's crushing the whole idea. So what's impression? An impression maintained too long becomes depressing. We suffer anxiety and depression as an honest admission of a weight we cannot bear because we are designed to float in thin air, just as you described your dreams as dreams are when you begin to see you have the volition to entertain them, and the fascination of them and the expansiveness of the fun of it becomes obvious rather than making believe the dream is real and you're in it, and now all of a sudden you're subject to the perils of falling out of space because somehow somewhere something's going to impact you that you have nothing to do with and cause you to no longer be able to fly. the distinction is clear.
Thank you, sir. I think we made a little more progress.
Well, listen, I really appreciate your challenges. It gives me something to think about differently than people who sort of acquiesce but don't really agree. So, and I get a lot of that. I could see it in their faces, but I appreciate it a lot, Tara. Very, very much.
Well,
Thank
I
you. And everyone,
appreciate your patience with me as I am exploring all of this.
well, we're going to grow up together. The functional capacity of our human experience does not immediately crystallize into an absolute state of loving expression because it's beginning to realize if we've been incapacitated, we've been decapitated in our thinking. We just haven't been thoughtful at all. We've been thoughtless and thinking that we were thoughtful. That starting to undo that starts to see that we have a little bit of work to do. But I would suggest that doing work on a natural basis is a lot quicker to achieve than thinking of it in an insane basis, which is impossible to ever achieve. The promise of addiction is failure. The promise of insanity is failure. It's destruction. It's non-existence because it doesn't exist. The promise of actual reality is that everything's possible. And that means we can consider impossible things are possible, but it also means we subject those possibilities to impossibility when we start thinking that, which simply isn't true. Possibility becomes possible, and all of a sudden the expansiveness of this contagion of health becomes obvious because we've always had it. We're just beginning to express it honestly, and it becomes a lot more alluring and a lot more easy, a lot more easily digested because it's not dis-easy. It's literally the ease and nature of nature being nature, and it's our nature right now.
That's a good
Thank
mic
you.
drop place. Goodbye, sir.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Until next time.